everyone, and welcome to our fantastic book release here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. We are so glad to have a famous author, new to the world, Dr. Dee Gillespie from the University of North Georgia. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, we have this book. Tell us the title of the book. Tell us a little bit about how you began researching it and why you think it's important. All that right there at the beginning.
So the title is The Citizenship Education Program and Black Women's Political Culture. And the book looks at a program that was widespread in the civil rights movement, but not as well known. So it was a program that, like I say in the book, everybody knew about, but nobody really knew about. So the program started as a experiment on the Sea Islands outside of Charleston. And the idea was to bring people together, teach them to read and write well enough that they could then go and pass the literacy test and be able to register to vote. So this was a program targeted in local African American communities because they were the ones who really faced the obstacle with that literacy test. And then the program eventually spread across the South. So it really is a way to retell the story of the civil rights movement in places that we don't typically think about or hear about. It also, because Black women taught these classes in places like the Mississippi Delta and in Selma, Alabama, it's also a way to rethink what we think happened in those places and move the kind of storyline into less familiar places. And then it puts African American women front and center in the narrative because they were the primary ones who were organizing these classes. And so it's a way to retell the story of the civil rights movement really from the grounding of Black women's leadership.
Let's back up for just a second and talk about, because fortunately most people today may not be familiar with the fact that there were literacy tests and other obstacles to voting in the South. Talk a little bit about that and the kind of obstacles those disenfranchised groups were facing.
So to take it all the way back, in 1870, the 15th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution, and the 15th Amendment said that you could not restrict the right to vote based on race. And so it's one of those Reconstruction amendments, those post-Civil War Reconstruction amendments. With the reimposition of white Southern power and dominance in Southern state governments, by the time we get to the early part of the 20th century, those Southern state governments then adopted a complex set of laws, complex set of criteria that people had to meet in order to be able to register to vote. And that criteria really disproportionately affected African Americans who were trying to register.
On purpose, right?
That's right,
yeah.
by design. And the literacy test was a part of that complicated criteria that you had to meet. There were property qualifications. There was a poll tax that in some states like Georgia was cumulative. So if you couldn't pay it one year, it added up and became an insurmountable obstacle. And as a result, African American voter registration plummets in southern states, certainly by the first decade of the 1900s. Those laws, then, that criteria stays in place into the 1960s. And it's not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed that we get a federal law that overrides all of those complex criteria and really opens the door to African American voter registration.
So the CEP is really an organization that is trying to overcome those obstacles by teaching literacy, by teaching citizenship. Tell us a little bit about how they've organized that on a grassroots level.
Sure. So it starts on the Sea Islands of South Carolina, and it started as an experiment, really. There was a local leader on Johns Island who was doing kind of a makeshift classroom on his bus. So Esau Jenkins was his name, and he ran a service where he had a bus and took Black workers from Johns Island into Charleston. And on the way each morning, he would pull over to the side of the road and drill the passengers on the South Carolina Constitution, which is what they needed to know in order to be able to register to vote, to pass this literacy test. And he was also an active part of the NAACP chapter in Charleston. And that brought him in contact with a woman named Septima Clark, who was a longtime school teacher in Charleston, a community leader in Charleston. But she was also making regular visits to a place called the Highlander Folk School. And the Highlander Folk School was this unique education kind of facility where the director, Miles Horton, had this crazy idea that you could bring people together, have them talk about issues that were common to them, and that through those discussions they could formulate solutions, that you didn't need to tell them what the answers were, that through that discussion they would share with each other, they would get to know each other, and that the solutions to the issues would emerge from those discussions. So Septima Clark invited Esau Jenkins to go with her to Highlander.
And this is in Tennessee, right?
In Tennessee,
Yeah.
That's right, in Monteagle, Tennessee, which is just outside of Chattanooga. And so Esau Jenkins went to Highlander, told Miles Horton what he was doing, and asked Miles Horton if he could offer some assistance to have a school, to move these lessons off of the bus. And so with Horton's help, they managed to get some foundation funding, because you always got to have money to do stuff.
The money.
That's right. And so then they found a teacher, someone who could lead this class. And the person that they invited to teach was not Septima Clark, who was a trained school teacher. Instead, it was Septima Clark's cousin, who was a hairdresser in Charleston. And initially, Bernice Robinson said, I don't know why you're asking me, because I'm not a teacher. I'm not going to be a teacher. And they said, you're exactly who we need, because we don't want someone who's going to go in with a preconceived idea of how to teach. We want someone who can take the Highlander model, where you bring people together and have them really learn from each other. We want you to bring that into this class. And so that's what she did. She started out with some elementary school materials that first night when those adults joined her. The 14 of them came bravely to this first citizenship school class. And they quickly turned off because the elementary school materials were just so basic that it was kind of insulting for these grown-ups. And so Bernice Robinson stopped and she said, well, what do you want to learn? And they told her, we want to learn how to read the Bible. We want to learn how to fill out a money order. We want to learn how to read the mail from our families rather than having our employer read the mail. Because when they read the mail to us, it brings them into our personal business. And we want to learn how to register to vote. And so she constructed this curriculum around those very practical requests. And that really became the hallmark for the program, right? So as the model then was transferred to communities across the South, African American women picked up the curriculum, but then also tailored it to the group of people that were in that particular class. And like I said, that really becomes kind of the hallmark of the program, that we've got this common goal of registering to vote, but we also want to make sure that we're meeting the specific and unique needs of these folks sitting in the room with us.
So how did women come to be the core of this program? How did they come to be the leaders and the movers that made it happen?
So by the time we get to the 1950s, which is when this first class opens, when teaching was certainly seen as women's work, right? The profession had been thoroughly feminized, so that when people went to school, they expected a woman to be the teacher. And for African American women, teaching remained one of the few professions that was open to them. In the Jim Crow South, there were a lot of restrictions, a lot of limitations on what African Americans could do for work. And for African American women, many of them found themselves with really either working in the fields or working in a white person's home. And teaching, though, was one of the professions that remained open for African American women. So this program really kind of taps into that preconceived idea that this is women's work. And so if we're going to have a program that's designed to be kind of grounded in education, then it makes sense that women would be the natural leaders. It was also seen as tapping into Black women's networks in communities. So some of the women who taught local classes come from church-based networks. So not only formal teaching in classrooms, but also Sunday school teaching, teaching lessons in the home, and passing on skills to the future generations. All of that kind of plays into this being seen as women's work.
But the students are male and female.
That's exactly right.
And they're what we today consider non-traditional. This is not for kids, right? This is an adult-focused program.
That's right. It was for really anybody 18 and over, and targeted at, like you're saying, as adults. So it wasn't a high school remedial program. It was really for adults that had come through Jim Crow segregated schools and come out with really poor literacy skills. And so in some ways, this program steps into fulfilled a necessary need in these communities. With the Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, then we had a federal ruling that said schools could not be segregated in the United States, that segregated schools were now unconstitutional, which held a promise for students who were in school at the time and students who would come in future generations. But Brown v. Board of Education didn't really do anything to address the fact that there had been several generations of African Americans who had moved through these segregated schools who came out very poorly educated. And so in part, these citizenship school classes then taught basic literacy to folks who just hadn't gotten those lessons. There's, in the records that I looked at, there's numerous stories of women sitting with older African American men, older African American women, and helping them learn how to write their names for the first time so that they could replace an X, right? Because an X, you lose your identity if that's your signature. But if you can sign your name, then you are somebody.
There's a lot of pride in that.
That's right.
There's a lot of pride in that.
That's right.
Well, and so when citizenship education program, it's not just literacy, reading, writing, and some math. Tell us a little bit about the civics parts of the lessons and what they were trying to also inculcate in these students.
Yeah, so the whole program was designed, the curriculum was designed to have all lessons kind of framed around civics, like you're saying, basic understanding of government. So the reading lessons were kind of vignettes about government. The vocabulary lessons were A is for alderman, L is for law, P is for precinct. And then included in this political education part of the curriculum was helping folks to understand, what does local government do? What does the state government do? What does the federal government do? What rights do you have that are guaranteed in the Constitution, right? And then if you wanted to influence that process, if you wanted to have a say in the decisions that affect your life, where are the lever points, right? So if we're going to now look at this class as an organizing unit, what are we going to organize to do? And then once we organize, where are the pressure points? And so as a result of the program, there's increased local political mobilization coming out of these classes, with folks taking note of precinct meetings and how you get appointed to a precinct, how you organize a ward and run a voter registration drive in a ward, and again, and then eventually how you get names on the ballot, right? So how you identify folks to run for office, how you mobilize the support that they're going to need to get into office. And all of that kind of comes out of the political education side of these classes.
So the model is proven to work. It starts to have a significant impact on local elections and government everywhere. And therefore, the CEP starts to get the attention of national civil rights organizations.
Well, Not quite. So that's not, I didn't explain it very well. It starts out under the auspices of the Highlander Folk School,
Right.
and it foundation funded. And then Miles Horton got concerned as the program grew that it was taking over Highlander, that it was becoming large enough that it was becoming difficult to do other things at Highlander. And Horton kind of saw Highlander as a place where you seed things like the Citizenship School, seed, SEED.
Right.
And then you pass them off to perhaps another organization that will sustain the program. So in 1961, the management of the program shifts to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was Martin Luther King's organization in Atlanta. And that's really the organization that oversees the broad replication of the program across Southern states.
And that brings in more funding?
It does. So the Field Foundation had been the primary source of funding when it was under Highlander, and once it moves to SCLC, the Field Foundation committed more money to support the expansion of the program.
Right.
It's this citizenship education program that brings Andrew Young to SCLC, and I think a lot of Georgia viewers anyway will be familiar with Andrew Young's name. Andrew Young, at the time we pick up his story here, he's a young man. He was working in New York for the National Council of Churches and looking for a way to come back south and be part of the movement. And so he caught Miles Horton's attention and got hooked into the citizenship education program just as it was getting transferred to SCLC. So he kind of went with the program to SCLC. Along with Septima Clark, who was the school teacher in Charleston. She also joined the staff of the SCLC. And then eventually they hired another woman named Dorothy Cotton, who came from Virginia and brought a lot of local organizing skills into the program.
Right. So we've talked about Charleston and Tennessee and New York, and we finally got Andrew Young in there for Georgia. So how does all this fit into Georgia history? What kind of research have you found that brings Georgia into the larger story of this?
So one of the first places that they expand the program after successful kind of implementation on the Sea Islands is down to Savannah. And so in 1960, the original teacher, citizenship school teacher, Bernice Robinson, made kind of an outreach trip to Savannah. And she arrives in Savannah in the midst of student-led sit-ins, in the midst of an NAACP-supported boycott. And so in contrast to the Sea Islands, where the citizenship schools in some ways kind of jump-started local action, the citizenship schools in Savannah kind of fold into a movement that's already moving and add another component to it, right? So the citizenship schools become another entry point for folks who maybe don't want to do a sit-in, don't want to march down the streets in public
Right.
and draw attention that way, but they could go to a citizenship school and be a part of the movement there and in a more hidden, more intimate space, and then perhaps gain the confidence they needed to be able to register to vote and perhaps get more involved in other kinds of activities.
So we're having a national, southern, within the South, an impact that this program is having. It's become a part of the SCLC, but being folded into that, this formerly independent program must have caused perhaps some administrative ripples, let's say, within the SCLC, and I know that the book talks a little bit about that. Can you share how that went down?
Yeah. For the SCLC, the addition of the citizenship education program it was kind of in some ways a stabilizing force because it was a proven program with money, but it was specific to citizenship schools, right? So you couldn't use the money more broadly. You have to remember this SCLC is an organization of Black male ministers, right? So they came with a particular frame of reference, and that is the Black church and their role as leaders in that church. The fact that the citizenship education program was seen as women's work meant that a lot of the SCLC leaders kind of saw this program as a women's auxiliary, right? So important work, but women's work, and not quite as out front as demonstrations in Birmingham or Martin Luther King making a large public address at the Lincoln Memorial at the March on Washington.
Right.
So for the citizenship education program, it doesn't necessarily get a whole lot of airtime in terms of SCLC history, because it's kind of always running in the background. But what the program does, like I said, is gives SCLC a foothold in these various communities and offers an entry point for people to join the local movement.
Does that cause a little bit of friction in mission? Like you were talking about, there's an expectation with the very male-dominated leadership for the organization, and now there are women who have a program, and I'm guessing they want a seat at the table, right? And so there has to be some sort of friction that arises, because this is something your book brings out that I really like, is that all social movements, they're not clean.
Yeah.
They're not totally idealistic cotton candy and unicorns, right? There's, even within organizations that are trying to do good and have a lot of moral power behind them, there's still some friction in how they operate.
That's right. And in oral history interviews that Dorothy Cotton and Septima Clark did after their involvement, right? So after they had left the SCLC, they were asked to reflect on exactly that. And they said, we noticed that we were always last on the agenda. And we noticed that at times when we would go to meetings, that there was an assumption that one of us would take the notes. But they also said at the time, we didn't necessarily let it bother us to the point where we didn't do the work, right? And both of them kind of attribute a women's movement of the 1960s that really brought feminist ideas into the mainstream, raising consciousness among women about gender dynamics, like what you're talking about. That both Septima Clark and Dorothy Cotton later reflected that it wasn't really until I got involved with that women's movement that I reflected back on what was going on at SCLC and saw the gender dynamics there.
Right.
So in terms of creating tension, they certainly noticed, right, that there was this gendered expectations, but didn't necessarily problematize that. Just kind of took it as, this is the way things are.
Right.
This is,
Okay.
they had both grown up in Black communities. They'd both grown up in the Black church. They knew how organizations operated. So it was not unexpected.
Right. So when we're looking at this new reach that it goes, how many people were involved in this program? How many, volunteers? How many teachers? How many students do they have over time? And I'm not going to hold you to exact numbers, but kind of give us an idea.
So ballpark, by 1965, about 1,500 people across the South had gone through the training to be a teacher. So there was a week-long training that you did. By the time the program moved to the SCLC, that training happened at a place called the Dorchester Center, which is in Midway, Georgia. Not many folks know where Midway is, but if you know where Fort Stewart is, or Hinesville, Georgia, Midway is just outside of Hinesville. And so people would gather from across the South. They would go through this week-long training, which was part curriculum training, part education about the movement, part political, kind of their own political education as a part of this training, and actually, part self-actualization, right? So kind of sharing your experience with other people and gaining the confidence that you'd need to be able to teach one of these classes. It also, those Dorchester sessions also became an important mentoring point where more experienced community leaders came to Dorchester, folks who were relatively new to the movement came, and like in the Highlander model, you had learning going on just when they sat down to have informal conversations at Dorchester. And so about 1,500 people cycle through that training. They went back and organized enough classes that about 23,500 people went through the classes.
Wow.
By 1965. And then the idea was that once you learn something in this class, don't hide your light under a bushel. You share what you've known, what you learn, and mobilize and encourage other people to be active in the community. Mm-hmm. So the program estimated that its reach was more like 95,000 people who were impacted in some way by the lessons from these citizenship school classes.
Which may not sound like a lot on a national scale, but when you start going down to those grassroots, small towns, small counties, I'm guessing that's a big difference.
That's right. And a lot of the classes were in rural areas. It was harder to plant the seeds in large cities. It was easier in a rural community where people knew each other, the networks were in place, and so the impact, like you're saying, proportional to the population that was in that community was certainly large. And with anything like this, right, it's hard to measure the actual impact. So estimating at 95,000, you can imagine that it probably rippled out from there.
So so they started in 57 and they continue through, they become a part of the SCLC. Then the Voting Rights Act happens in 65, and it seems like after 65, it slowly started to sort of trickle away. Mm-hmm. What caused that? What sort of made the program fade away? Because it did fade away, right? It didn't just, there wasn't a cutoff. It just sort of.
You're exactly right. So the good news for the Voting Rights Act was that it overrode all of these laws that had put these difficult criteria in place. The bad news for the citizenship education program was it undercut their very reason for existence, right? But
which is good,
but program administrators also argued that just because you pass this law doesn't mean people can read and write, right? So
they don't need to know about being a citizen.
That's right.
It's even more important.
And so there's an effort to retool the program after 1965, and really to align it with goals that were coming out of the War on Poverty programs by that point, the community organizing and putting programs and supports in place to help people in poverty to lift themselves out of poverty and stay out of poverty. So the literacy lessons kind of get folded into that kind of mindset that literacy is a central part of lifting yourself out of poverty. And this program had a proven track record in being able to teach people to read and write, at least the basic fundamentals, in a relatively short amount of time. But the difficulty is convincing funders, right, that you can do this work and that your program can effectively address these issues of poverty, which had always kind of been there, but not the focus of the program.
Right.
At the same time, there were efforts underway in Congress to cut funding for those War on Poverty programs. So at the same time that the CEP then is kind of retooling and looking for different sources of funding, the sources of funding were increasingly drying up because of the larger political debates about funding these kinds of programs, and the fact that those funding was getting cut. So the program really kind of runs out of steam by 1970. And there were the Field Foundation also informed the CEP administrators that it was wanting to pull back, and maybe it was time to broaden out the funding base for the program. And it just became very difficult to do that as the 60s came to a close. It was foundations were not as the wallets were not as open as they had been earlier in the decade.
Well, I do want to get to some questions, but before I do that, give us the 2-minute version of what you want people to take away from this book.
Well, I think, like I said, it's a way to retell the story of the civil rights movement. And so if you know the kind of trail of historical events from Brown v. Board of Education to the Montgomery bus boycott and on into the 60s, this book reframes some familiar things and also talks about lesser known places. The main thing is that women were leaders in the movement. They were not followers always, that they were leaders, and this program is a clear indication of that and evidence of that.
Absolutely. Neat.
Yeah.
So the book is available where fine books are sold. You can also get it on the History Center's website, on our web store, at the link that I believe is showing on the screen now. You can go get it there. You can even, at some point, probably drive down to the University of North Georgia, interrupt one of Dr. Gillespie's classes, and she will be happy to sign that. And I think we may be able to get her to sign some of the ones we have in the shop, if that's something of interest. So this is a fascinating program that you've brought to light. Here's how you know it's been ignored. There's no Wikipedia article on it, folks. If you're desperately searching for the CEP on Wikipedia, it's not there. Sounds like someone needs to write one, Dr. Gillespie.
Well, they need to read my book.
There you go. then they can write that.
That's right.
So let's see. I don't know, Linda. Let's see if there are any questions that folks have for Dr. Gillespie about the book, about the research, or just about anything that ties into the civil rights and women's leadership in that program.
All right. Hello, everyone. Libba here from behind the scenes. And I see that Lisa has a question. Dr. Gillespie, was SNCC and in particular Fannie Lou Hamer involved in this program as well? And perhaps you could give some context as to who Fannie Lou Hamer is.
So thank you for the question. And so the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is SNCC, was another active organization during the civil rights movement. This program overlaps with SNCC activities in the Mississippi Delta most notably. So both SCLC and SNCC were very active in grassroots organizing in the Mississippi Delta. If folks are familiar with Freedom Summer, Freedom Schools, and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, that was kind of the outgrowth of all of that civil rights organizing in the Mississippi Delta. Fannie Lou Hamer was a sharecropper in the Mississippi Delta who plugged into the movement through the mass meetings that were going on as a part of that civil rights organizing in 1962, 1963. Fannie Lou Hamer actually attended a citizenship education program teacher training session that was held in the Delta. So I have her name on a list that says that she was one of the people who attended that training. Fannie Lou Hamer, though, was a force of nature, a powerful force, and really wasn't interested in doing things the way that people told her to do them. So actually teaching a structured curriculum wasn't necessarily her cup of tea. So instead, we have evidence that she took the lessons that she learned from the teacher training and then kind of taught impromptu classes. So when folks would come and see her in her yard, she would,
open up the classroom.
Right, start up a conversation and then work in, did you know about voter registration? And did you know about these classes? And did you know that this is how the political system works? And in a lot of ways, it informed her own understanding of the political system. She became a delegate for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And that was the group from Mississippi that went to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City in 1964 and directly challenged the all-white Democratic delegation from Mississippi and challenged the National Democratic Party to recognize the MFDP, which was an integrated group, and reject the credentials of the all-white delegation, and really put the heat on the National Democratic Party. In the end, Fannie Lou Hamer gave testimony at the Credentials Committee and talked about her experience as a sharecropper, talked about her experience trying to register to vote, talked about a beating that she received while in jail in 1963. And it was really graphic testimony. Lyndon Johnson interrupted her testimony with a press conference, which then drew national news attention to Lyndon Johnson, hoping that then her testimony wouldn't get airtime. But the nightly news stories picked it up because it was a compelling story. So then it played over and over again. And you could just imagine President Johnson, every time it came on. And so Fannie Lou Hamer at that point really became a household name in ways that she hadn't been before. So she was involved in this program tangentially, but was certainly an active part and a central part of that Mississippi Delta movement.
And we have another question. You mentioned that funding for this program was through donations. Could you give us a little more information on who funded this program?
So the funding came from a private foundation. And it was a foundation called the Field Foundation. The money, it was philanthropic money, right? So it came from anybody familiar with Chicago will be familiar with the Marshall Field Department Store. It's that family's foundation, right? So it was their way of distributing their wealth to causes that they believed in. And so that was the foundation that funded this program for the majority of the time. I should also mention that money was used to pay salaries, but it was also used to pay teacher stipends. So when teachers organized a class, they could earn a $30 stipend for each month that they taught a class. And for a lot of these teachers, $30 was an economic lifeline in the 1960s. Doing this kind of work had the potential to draw unwanted attention to you and your family. And if that happened, then this stipend that came from outside of the community really was an economic lifeline, because it meant that your family had money that wasn't tied to a white employer and could continue to pay your bills, continue to buy food. And so the Field Foundation money, like I said, paid for salaries at SCLC, but also was a support line for these teachers.
And Jeff asks, did the white community have any reaction to this program? Was there any concern?
It's a mixed reaction. It's a good question. So a lot of these classes were taught in African American communities, and so they were hidden from view, but certainly not unknown. And so we have some reports of teachers who, if a white employer couldn't fire the teacher for engaging in this activity, then a member of the family was fired as a sign, as a signal to stop, to cease and desist. In the Mississippi Delta in particular, there were reports of night riders riding by women's homes who were teaching these classes and throwing Molotov cocktails up on the porch, or having dogs outside of their houses and just letting the dogs bark all night long. One teacher in the Mississippi Delta talked about walking outside her door one day and there was a pile of rattlesnakes that somebody had left on her porch as a sign to stop doing this. And so, yes, they did. There was a response in some communities to this activity, but not as much as you might expect. And again, it's in part because these classes happened in church halls, in private living rooms, and within an African American community, a Black community. And intentionally so that they would not draw that kind of attention.
Like you say, it's much more low key than staging a demonstration through the middle of town.
That's right. That's right. And if you're trying to encourage people to have confidence to do something that they know is going to be risky, then having them come to a place where they know the teacher, they know the other students in the room, they can then gain that confidence in what would be a safe place to do that. And then once they gain that confidence, they're part of a group, right? So you're not kind of putting yourself out there on your own. You're now part of a group that's mobilized and ready to take action.
Right. All right. Well, folks, that's unfortunately all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Gillespie. It has been a pleasure having you.
Well, I enjoyed being here. I enjoyed talking about the book. So any opportunity.
It's a neat book. And as I said, you can get it at the Northeast Georgia History Center website online shop. Just follow that link and we can make sure, if you so desire, we could get a signed copy for you. So thanks for tuning in to this great program. We hope to do more book releases soon. But tonight, I want to thank Dr. Gillespie and wish everyone safe travels, stay safe, and take care.